He pulled up to the gate with the engine still warm, as if motion could be bottled and kept between his ribs. The city lights had thinned behind him. The long glass corridor of his house swallowed the remaining noise. He held the wheel for a long moment, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror. A man in a dark suit, shoulders as rigid as the cars that waited for him outside. The briefcase on the passenger seat looked smaller than a lifetime of obligations. Renan had learned to arrive like a shadow. His name came with doors opening and mouths closing. Power paid for his privacy. Tonight was supposed to be quiet. Another late meeting that slid into a cancelled dinner. Another solitary birthday in a house that had everything but the reason anyone would come. He told himself 100 small truths. Birthdays were business days. Family could wait. The boys were fine. He had arranged that they be fine. As the house swallowed his footsteps, the corridor felt colder than he expected. The light from the foyer was clinical, the paintings deliberate. His shoes made no sound on marble, and for years that silence had been a rhythm he had kept. He moved through halls that knew him only by habit. Staff passed with practiced ease, a nod, no questions. There was the soft clink of china somewhere ahead, the comforting noise of routines performed by others. Then the garden opened. Warm sunlight pooled in a rectangle of grass, not the precise manicured perfection he paid for, but a small, human scatter of things. A towel spread on the lawn like a stubborn little island, mismatched paper plates, a small fan of paper streamers caught in the hedge. 4 boys in crooked yellow t-shirts sat cross-legged, faces dusted with chocolate. A modest cake sat on a low box, chocolate, with too many candles and an earnest, uneven frosting heart. On a little plate, brigadeiros, tiny, sticky chocolate sweets, glinted like pearls. The air hummed with summer insects and the unsettled delight of children pretending a picnic could be a kingdom. They didn't see him at first. A dry twig snapped under his heel, an accidental herald. One of the boys looked up and squinted, searching the leafy border as if a rabbit might be hiding there. Another returned to smearing frosting on his chin. It should have been a simple, private thing. It wasn't his garden, though. It was someone else's kindness. She stood by the towel with flour on her hands and a child's braid clipped behind her ear. Beatrice, Tia Bia to the boys, to anyone who had ever watched her with them, moved with that steady gravity a person develops when they have been the axis of someone else's life for as long as she had. Her blouse carried the faint scent of soap and cake. Her eyes measured him once and then folded into a calm he recognized from years of invisible labor. She did not startle. She did not step forward. She only let him arrive. For a moment, Renan thought he could pass, that he could nod, claim the role of absentee father, and be done with it as he had 1,000 times before. Then the smallest boy, Pedrinho, the one with chocolate up to his ears and a smudge on his nose, stared straight at him and said, with the blunt honesty of someone who lived in the present and did not keep adult excuses, "Are you our daddy?" The line landed like a fist. The world condensed to the sound of his own breath and the thin brush of summer air. He had expected anger, or at least a polite distance. He had not expected that question shaped with such small certainty. He recognized the names as if they were postcards dropped through a slot of memory. Pedrinho, João, Miguel, Gabriel, the 4 boys who had been living like a constellation in his household, circling someone who wasn't there. He recognized Beatrice in the way the boys leaned toward her, in the instant that they all fell into a kind of orbit around the woman who had been more parent than employee. Hours, months, years of absence stacked like invoices in his head. Meetings, guard changes, flights, late-night talks in rooms with curtains drawn. Power had been a ledger. You sign here, you take what you need. Never in it had he budgeted for fatigue in the bones or the slow drain of the small things. Those losses had been paid in installments. He let his briefcase slip from his hand, the sound of it thudding against marble like the fall of something heavier than leather. Everyone looked. The 4 faces were open. Pedrinho's question had upset the surface of their day. That fissure let light in. Beatrice folded her hands over the edge of the towel and smiled softly in a way that wasn't for him. "We thought we'd make a little celebration," she said, the words even and practical. They kept asking. No one told them anything, so I told them we could make something here. Her voice carried no accusation. There was only a logistics of care in it, a clarity that had lengthened into her posture. He should have been furious. He felt none of the justified anger of a man whose domain had been trespassed. He felt small in an unexpected way, like someone discovering he had been wearing a mask all his life, and it had never quite fit. The boys were not shy with questions. They were direct and unashamed. The taller one, João, with a missing front tooth and the boldness of youth, asked, "Where have you been?" Miguel, small, serious, the one who kept a little notebook in his pocket, reached out and handed it to him before Renan could brace himself. The handwriting inside was large and careful, a child's world in blunt lines. Today's drawing, Papi and us. There were 5 figures drawn in crayon, 4 small stick silhouettes, and 1 bigger one with a lopsided tie. He knelt, because kneeling felt less theatrical and more necessary. The grass prickled through the fabric of his suit. Miguel watched him, eyes like a mirror. Renan read the child's scrawl and felt the letters as accusations and confessions both. Papi. The word itself was small and tender, a bridging of languages and expectation. He did not know if he had earned it. He picked at a frosting smear with his thumb and tasted chocolate that had nothing to do with any deal he'd ever closed. The boys giggled at the absurd spectacle of their father, who could count houses and company shares, but couldn't even blow out his candles without holding 2 fingers awkwardly across his mouth. When he tried to sing, his voice came out wrong, off-key, hesitant, but it was the first honest sound he'd made in months. The boys corrected him gently, and instead of the insulation of facades, there was human warmth, messy, stained, and making small demands. It was Beatrice who put the thing into words he had known but never let himself feel. "They need you here," she said, "not your money. They need to have you." The sentence was not a rebuke as much as a ledger finally balanced. He had thought presence was transactional. He sent people, paid teachers, bought toys. Beatrice's needlepoint of care had stitched the actual need into sight. They wanted their dad. Renan's hands shook. He had never been a man given to tears. They were ineffable and private, to be wiped before anyone could ask why. But there, on the towel with a cake that would never be Instagram perfect, and a woman who had tended their knees and noses and late-night fevers, something unmade in him. He covered his face with his hands and found he was crying, quiet, unshamed, not performative. The boys stopped eating for a moment. Their eyes were bright with curiosity, the same look gardeners get when a planted seed finally cracks. Beatrice sat down beside him, close enough to be solid. "You don't have to fix it all tonight," she said. "Just start showing up. That's how kids learn you mean it." He wanted to promise too many things. The urge to orchestrate a fix ran through him, to call staff, schedule days, set rules. But the simplicity of her sentence held him. Just start showing up. That was a thing he could do without grand speeches. Later, after the cake had been eaten with sticky fingers, and after he had attempted, very badly, to braid a boy's hair and been laughed into better attempts, Beatrice led him to the side, holding a battered school notebook between her palms. Inside, in the child's uneven letters, were lists and drawings, favorite foods, a short narrative about a hero who brought gifts, a doodle of a man holding hands with 4 little stick figures. There were notes that read, "Miguel likes apples," and "Gabriel afraid of thunder." Each tiny line was a map he had never learned and now had to memorize. She named them for him, one by one, not in a hurry, but in the practical cadence of a woman who had watched them grow. Pedrinho clung to the familiar. He loved stories of dinosaurs, and had a habit of hiding under chairs when storms began. João was all noise and experiments. His pockets were always full of paper planes. Miguel, who had handed him the notebook, had a seriousness beyond his age. He wrote things down to make them safe. Gabriel was the oldest by minutes and the most careful. He checked doors twice and asked questions like proof. As she spoke, Renan traced the margins of the notebook that smelled faintly of glue and soap. Each annotation was an accusation that softened into grace. He had been absent in 1,000 tiny ways. Missed breakfasts, absent from sports, returned home still keyed to a life with other priorities. Here, sitting on a towel where a cake had been cut unevenly, he confronted the ledger of his life in a language of crayons and chocolate. He asked the boys their ages awkwardly, and they recited them as if rehearsing a lesson. 6, 6, 6, 6, 4 little planets in a single orbit. He realized, with the bluntness of a man who had let a week of calendars slide by, that he did not know which color shirt Miguel preferred, what João did when he fell and scraped his knees, which bedtime story made Pedrinho believe that monsters were only pretend. Those were ordinary facts he had failed to acquire, and in the place where affection lived, they were holes. Beatrice watched him with the kind of patience that had years behind it. "You never stayed," she said without ceremony, "and you can't make up for that with things." The sentence had no malice, only a careful truth. If there had been a reproach in it, it was the reproach of someone who had spent nights reading lullabies aloud so that 4 boys might sleep without their father. She had done more than manage the house. She had held the shape of the family steady when his life, big rooms, late appointments, the weight of a name, made that impossible. He tried to say he was sorry, which sounded insufficient and sudden. Apologies had become abstract in rooms where money could soften edges. But apology here needed to be a form of practice, not just language. He vowed, clumsily and honestly, to come back tomorrow. He vowed to start small. Breakfasts, school drop-offs, Sunday afternoons. Beatrice watched the promises like a gardener listening for rain. "Promises are easy," she said. "Roots are hard. Show up when it's boring, when it's hard." He thought of his life as an accumulation of crises and triumphs, arranged neatly in his head like trophies. The banalities Beatrice wanted were not trophies. They were daily humidity, repetition, the sort of steadiness his work life had always denied him. To choose routine was to choose a new kind of courage. After the first day, when he left the towel and the crumbs and the boys who called him with the particular mixture of hope and entitlement only children could manage, he walked back through the house like a man leaving a tent where the fire had been relit. His suit smelled different, of grass and chocolate. He did not go to his study. He paused outside Miguel's door, listening to the household breathing. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like a place that could be made into a home rather than just a repository of his life. When he reached the polished hall where a driver and an assistant waited for him to resume the ritual of power, his phone buzzed with messages that could have been filed under the many things that used to define him. He silenced it and slid back into the waiting car, the city's pulse rising to meet him. But he was not the same man who had arrived that morning. A quietness had attached to him, a new responsibility that did not come with instructions. The next morning he did what he'd promised. He arrived before the school van. The boys greeted him like a band of small conspirators finding a missing piece. There was a shyness in them, but also a sunshine that had been waiting for something to respond to. He made coffee and managed cereal without igniting a domestic emergency. He practiced the small, human rituals of parenthood, tying shoelaces, listening to complaints about a toy elephant, being present for the nonsense of their day. It felt clumsy at first, like learning to walk, but the awkwardness was honest, and it made a different kind of sound than the hollow certainties of his old life. Beatrice watched from the kitchen doorway, folding a dish towel with slow, expert hands. There was a softness to her look that was not pity. She had taught him how the children snapped together into pattern. Who calmed down when you hummed? Who needed to be told the same thing 3 times? Which two would hide the other's socks just to start a reported search? She said nothing at first, letting him practice the new habit for a day or 2 as if it might hold. Yet life is never generous with more time than we ask for. 2 weeks after the picnic, Beatrice came to him with an envelope in her hand and a tightness around her mouth. She had a way of speaking directly that made small things sound like decisions and large things like duties. "My sister," she said. "She is sick. I have to go home for a bit." The words settled into the house like sudden wind. The boys were in the next room building towers out of blocks. The sound of their laughter hit this news like a bell. Beatrice's fingers in his were an unassuming anchor. She did not ask permission. She simply stated the fact with the kind of certainty a person develops when they live by the rule of what must be done. He heard 1,000 practical plans clambering in his head: salaries, replacements, a schedule rearranged so he would not have to feel the absence she would leave. He opened his mouth to offer money, to arrange for a hired nanny, to smooth the logistics with the ease he knew so well. Beatrice's eyes tightened a fraction. "I won't take money," she said. "My sister needs me, and I have to go. I want to know you'll be here when I'm gone." There it was, the real doorway slammed open. He had been learning to show up in daylight, under Beatrice's steady direction. Now she was pulling herself away, not because she wanted to, but because obligation in her world was a different kind of ledger. Her leaving would not be drama. It would be the slow unstrapping of a safety net. The boys crowded behind the towel and listened. They were not oblivious. They had watched Beatrice with the kind of watchfulness that remembers who fixes the skinned knees and who reads the pages twice. Miguel's lower lip trembled. João's hands shoved into his pockets as if to hold on to something. Pedrinho climbed onto Renan's knee and looked at him like a question that demanded a lifetime of answers. "What will we do?" Gabriel asked. There was an adult logic bleeding into the child's worry. They had been rehearsing a system of small supports and now discovered the fulcrum, Beatrice, sliding away. Renan felt a fierce, unfamiliar heat rush through him. This was the moment the lesson had been preparing for. The practice was about to be tested. He could call in help and set up temporary care, and of course he could afford excellent care. But he was beginning to understand that money could not replicate the particular constancy of the woman who had been more parent than employee, more anchor than hired hand. The boys would know the difference. He had learned that in a child's crayon scrawl, and in the way Miguel tucked his notebook into his pocket as if it were a talisman. "I'll be here," he said finally, an offering and a command both. His voice had a new steadiness. It was not a promise that erased the months of absence, but it was a commitment that might, with time, form the bridge. He was not naive. He knew there would be missteps, long stretches of being late, days when meetings would swallow him again. But the decision was a turning point. He would make room in a life built on urgency for something slow. Beatrice folded the hand she had placed on his into her apron and smiled a small, fierce smile. She believed him in that cautious way that people who had tended to others for years learn. They accept a change and watch it like a gardener watches a seed. "Then show up when I'm gone," she said. "Don't let this become another promise on paper." He stood there, the sun tilting through the window, and felt the weight of a new kind of ledger. It was measured not in contracts or criminal influence or power, but in pancakes flipped at dawn and questions answered about school projects and scraped knees kissed better. It felt harder than any negotiation he'd ever made. It felt, urgently, like repair. Behind him, the house hummed with the ordinary. The boys building empires of blocks. A radio playing a distant, insignificant song. The kettle beginning to boil. Somewhere in the city beyond the hedges, deals were still being made. Cars still waited. But in this small garden, the geometry of his life had changed. the towel on the grass, the crooked candles, the crayon drawing with 5 figures. All of them were gentle accusations and invitations at once. He had pledged to start. Now Beatrice's departure pulled him toward the core test of that pledge. The next days would not be easy. They would be honest. They would ask things of him that his old life never had. He folded the notebook back into Miguel's hand and looked at the boys with the fierceness of someone who had finally seen what was missing. "Tell me how to do it," he said to Beatrice, low, like a man asking how to read a map he had neglected. "Tell me everything." She pulled him close, not to coddle, but to hand him knowledge. Her list began with the small things, the names of teachers, the time for ballet class, Miguel's need for a nightlight. She wrote down rituals and preferences on a scrap of paper. Who liked jam? Who got scared during thunder? Which bedtime story could calm a storm? Each note was a key. The boys listened, and each time an item landed, the boys' faces brightened as if a small fortress were being assembled. When Beatrice mentioned the date she had to leave, a little silence dropped across the towel. It became a calendar on which he could not afford to write a single absent day. He felt at once inadequate and resolved. For the first time, the measure of a man to him had nothing to do with force or fear. It would be measured by his willingness to be present in the mornings and to show up for the difficult ordinariness of parenting. The day before she left, the air carried a different quality. The house moved with packing boxes and whispered instructions. The boys clung to Beatrice with a sincerity that both warmed and punished him. There were 4 small arguments about who would sit on which knee during the last story. Renan found a rhythm that was halting and entirely human. He made pancakes and burned half of them, and the boys declared them delicious anyway. Miguel pressed his forehead against Renan's shoulder and drew a new picture, 5 stick figures again. But this time the bigger figure's tie was crooked in the same way Renan's always was. The picture felt like an earnest map, and the crooked tie felt like an invitation. Beatrice left at dawn. She did not dramatize her departure. She kissed each boy and murmured instructions into ears shaped by small, avid attention. She handed Renan a folded list, the spine of it worn with the palms that had smoothed it, the handwriting steady and plain. "Call if you need help," she said, "but don't let the kids feel you leaving. Keep your word." He took the list like someone holding a lit match. It was a fragile, combustible thing. As the car that would take her away disappeared down the lane, a small hush fell on the house. The boys clustered around the window as if to hold onto the tale of her leaving. Miguel held his notebook tighter than ever. Renan understood, with an almost physical sensation, that life was asking him to trade a kingdom of influence for a kitchen of ordinary tasks. He had fought his way to the top of his world by controlling outcomes, but this was not a problem to solve at the level of control. It required presence, mistakes, and time. That morning, when the house was quiet in a way that felt precarious, he sat at the kitchen table with the list Beatrice had left, and a steaming cup of coffee cooling at his hand. The list was practical and intimate. Allergies, bedtime rituals, a note about Miguel's notebook, and where to find extra batteries for the nightlight. It concluded with a single line in the margin that read, "Be patient with yourself." He turned that phrase over in his mouth like a small instruction manual, and for the first time in a long life of commands, practiced the simplest of disciplines, listening. The boys were away at school that day. The house hummed in a new key. He watched the clock and honored its small rituals. He made the bed. He swept the floor where crumbs had gathered. He reheated a portion of leftover cake and tasted it, finding the chocolate still there and unexpectedly human. At 2 p.m, he waited by the gate. When the school van arrived with the children who had been his long-neglected priorities, the boys poured out with sticky faces and stories in their mouths, and he greeted them with a steadiness that felt like a new muscle. When Miguel slid a hand into his, unannounced, and whispered that he had a new drawing, Renan felt the world tilt toward the ordinary, and with it, toward a kind of repair he had never allowed himself before. He had started a practice. The real test was just beginning. Outside, the city pulsed on. Inside, on a towel that would one day be replaced, on a cake plate with knife marks, a life was being rewritten in small gestures. He did not yet know how hard it would be, or what would break along the way. He only knew that the boys had used a word, papi, and that for all the power his name carried outside the hedges, this was the only place that mattered now. If this moves you, tell us in the comments what home means to you. Days folded into each other with the rhythm of new practice. He learned to wake without the adrenaline that had once filled his lungs. He learned that being there at 6 in the morning mattered in ways that no boardroom had ever taught. He kept a pen on the fridge and slowly filled it with notes. Miguel likes to sleep with a blue shark. João needs to be praised for trying before being corrected. Pedrinho refuses vegetables unless they are presented as something heroic. He made mistakes. He arrived late for a recital because of a meeting he thought he could not miss, and Pedrinho's face at the show of an almost empty chair was a bruise he carried for weeks. But he came back, apologetic and present, and the boys accepted him with the forgiving hunger of small children who want a parent more badly than they want any consistency. Yet the house held edges that money could not smooth. At night he would find himself standing at the doorway to Miguel's room, listening to the boy breathe and thinking about all the things he had missed. First words, first fears, the way a child's small hand fits into an adult's. He read Miguel's notebook as if decoding a new language. The scribbles revealed a wisdom in miniature, lists of things that made a child safe and things that made a child brave. Renan copied those lists into his own notebook, the handwriting purposeful and deliberate. The act of copying felt like a promise made legible. One afternoon, the boys found an old picnic towel in a linen closet, a sun-faded rectangle that Beatrice had used for summers and improvised celebrations. They asked him, in the matter-of-fact way children ask anything, to have another picnic. Renan said yes without thinking, and he meant it. He arranged sandwiches, burned the edges of some bread, and made a lemonade that was too sweet. The food was mediocre. The intention was not. They laughed at his attempts to fold paper napkins correctly. He told a story about a clumsy knight who kept dropping his sword, and the boys corrected him with plot twists they invented. For the first time, power looked like being laughed at by children and surviving the humility. At night, when the house had settled and the city beyond the hedges returned to its own distant hum, he would sit by the window and think of Beatrice, of her hands, the way they knew every nick and need, the way she had taught him how to be small and start over. He wanted to thank her properly. He wanted to return what she had given with a currency she could accept, his effort. Then, one evening, a note arrived. Beatrice's handwriting was quick, a few lines folded into the pocket of her apron that she had left behind. She had written about her sister's condition, how the doctors were uncertain, and how she would be gone longer than she had first thought. She wrote with a calmness that made the words worse. Her note closed with a sentence she had said to him already, and that he had nodded to, the instruction to show up when she was not there. He placed the note on the table and ran his finger along the ink until the print blurred. He had promised to do it. Now the promise felt like a vow. The city would still call him to the old rhythms, but a new gravity had formed. The boys needed him. He no longer carried only a name that opened doors. He carried a handful of small, urgent things that required him to be awake at ordinary hours and to give his time to small rituals. When storm clouds gathered one night and the electricity whined in the distance, Miguel's fear reappeared. He came into the guest room and climbed into the bed beside Renan, hands twisted in the sheet. The man who was used to commanding rooms found himself fumbling with a flashlight in the dark. He made a terrible attempt at a shadow puppet until Miguel laughed, the sound dissolving the tension. The boy fell asleep to the scraped voice of a man telling a story he had never told before. In the kitchen the next morning, Renan found Beatrice's taped instructions about the nightlight and batteries. He had by now begun to set reminders and keep spare chargers, small acts that seemed ridiculous in his former life, but were now lifelines. He measured his days in the little successes, the boys eating vegetables without a fight, him arriving at the school gate on time, a bedtime story that took Miguel to sleep faster than the previous night. And yet, there was always the edge of the other world, an ever-present set of obligations that required his announcements and signatures. He managed to cancel one trip that a colleague called urgent. He delegated another meeting to someone with better time. He made choices that felt like small acts of rebellion against the architecture of his old life. Each choice required resistance and a shuttling of power that unsettled colleagues and adjusted expectations. One afternoon, as he was getting into the rhythm of being both a man of presence and a man who still carried a name, an unexpected thing happened. Miguel took his hand and led him to the wall where drawings were taped. They had a place now at eye level, a rotating gallery of crayon and marker. There was the first cake drawing, the crooked tie, a picture of a house with 5 stick figures under a sun that looked suspiciously like a coin. Miguel pointed to one drawing and said simply, "This is my favorite. It has all of us." Renan looked at the drawing and felt a softness like warm rain. In the midst of all the administrative reorganizing of his life, this felt like a sign that small things were knitting into consolation. He had not yet repaired everything. He had bumbled and apologized, and been forgiven in the childlike way of boys who wanted their father more than they wanted perfection. But the drawing, crayon lines and a sun that could not be aligned, was proof that some places of belonging could be rebuilt. And then, as if to remind him that life does not stop to let us practice virtue, a call came from Beatriz. Her voice was short over the line. She said the trip home had been extended. The doctors were not sure how long she would stay, and the house would be his for an indefinite stretch. Her tone suggested trust and a challenge both. She was not panicked. She trusted him enough to leave. That trust felt both like a gift and a task. He folded his hands around the phone after she hung up and looked at the boys making a fort in the living room with blankets and a chair. The house felt heavier, not in the way of being burdened, but in the way a responsibility does when it is finally worn instead of just held. There would be mornings he failed. There would be nights he wanted to run back into the old rhythms. But the commitment had begun. The day blurred. He learned to pack lunches and to hide the fact he was their boss to the outside world. He learned to trade secrecy for presence. He had not yet earned everything. Trust takes years. But he had begun the currency exchange. Then, one late afternoon, as the sky bruised and a faint chill crept through the windows, Beatrice returned for a day. The boys exploded at the sight of her, and the house rearranged itself to welcome her presence like water to a dry sponge. She was lighter than before in some ways, heavier in others. She had news he had not expected. Things at home were worse. The doctors wanted her to stay. The leave she had hoped would be a brief repair was turning into something longer. The news was a hinge. He felt it in the way a man feels a gust when a door closes behind him. This was the moment he had to decide whether being present would be a habit he kept or a promise he abandoned when the work of it became real. He looked at the boys, at the drawing on the wall, at Beatrice's quiet face, and felt the full measure of what she had sacrificed for them for years. He swallowed. He had started to learn the language of ordinary care. He had messed it up, and he had corrected himself. The tests were beginning. He would have to be the person who kept the doors shut against his old life more often than not. He would have to accept that presence might cost him influence, or at least demand its rearrangement. That evening, when the house finally settled, and the boys dozed into a sleep they had earned through a day of fort-building and sticky fingers, Renan sat alone with the list Beatrice had given him, and a new one he had written in his own careful hand. Days he would not travel, teachers' numbers, the name of the pediatrician Miguel liked better. He underlined things, made notes, crossed out items he'd resolved to tackle. The list looked like a map of a life he had only just begun to build. Outside, city noise continued. The world he had been born into and had ruled didn't stop. Inside, something else was being built, a small, imperfect home. He closed the notebook and listened to the house breathe. The weight in his chest was not all regret. It was purpose. When he finally climbed the stairs toward the boys' rooms, there was a picture halfway between a question and a promise taped to the hallway wall. 5 figures under a sun, drawn by a small hand. He traced it with his finger. His reflection stood tall in the polished frame opposite, the man who could command rooms and yet had discovered he had to learn to be ordinary. He thought of Beatrice and the way she had taught him to listen, and he felt gratitude and the first honest awareness of what it would take to stay. Night fell, and he sat at the foot of Miguel's bed until the rise and fall of the child's breath steadied. There were no sudden awakenings to miraculous competence, only the steady work of showing up, of answering the small alarms a boy's fear offered. He held Miguel's hand and felt the soft, relentless truth of a life being stitched. Presence, he was realizing, was itself a kind of power, a quieter one, with no headlines, but with the capacity to change the shape of things. Outside the window, a car passed slowly down the drive, and somewhere in the city, a life of different noise continued. Inside, a man who had once left the world to chase a name was learning to stay. The road ahead was not neat. It would be long and messy. But for the first time in years, he had the map Beatrice had made, and a small room of boys ready to show him what it meant to be a father. When Beatrice hugged him before she left again, this time with a longer goodbye than before, she pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand. On it were tiny notes, reminders, the names of the teachers, and, in the margin, an extra line. Keep their birthdays. Remember the little things. He read it and felt the enormity of a task that would not be completed overnight. He promised out loud, then watched her walk away. The afternoon light fell across the grass where the towel still lay, now dotted with the shadows of leaves. The boys had left toys strewn like small islands. A paper plane rested near the cake plate, its tip sticky with frosting. He crouched and gathered a few of the crumbs with his fingers, as if by touching the small mess he could measure the distance he'd already walked. Days bled into months, with a rhythm that felt like a new muscle growing. There were mornings when it hurt to get up, achy from late nights, or the peculiar exhaustion of a man who had traded adrenaline for routine. But he kept showing up. He learned the choreography of ordinary life in a way business had never taught him. He learned to set a timer for eggs. He learned to make school lunches that, while not Instagram ready, were eaten with enthusiasm if a small note was tucked inside. Love you more than dinosaurs. He tacked Miguel's drawings to the hallway with pride, rotating them like trophies that meant more than any plaque on his office wall. His presence did not arrive perfect or swift. There were missteps that gouged at him, a board meeting he couldn't avoid, a delayed flight that made him miss a parent-teacher conference, a rainy morning when a flat tire turned into an absence at a recital. He kept a private ledger of failures, the instances he had promised and not shown. Each one settled in his chest like a small stone. But he returned more quickly than he had in the past. He apologized with specificity. "I'm sorry I missed your play. I should have been there," and the boys taught him to fold apology into action. They forgave with the readiness of children, yes, but also they reminded him that forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. The city still expected its man. Messages that once felt like mandates now had different gravity. He learned to reroute obligations, delegate, delay, name boundaries. It became a kind of civil war with the old architecture of his life. He discovered colleagues who were quietly resentful when he refused a late call. He encountered allies who made room. He used his influence differently, opening a door for a teacher's new after-school program. insisting a contractor honor the boys' request for a simple shelf to display their art. These were small uses of power, domestic interventions that felt almost tender. When the nights felt heavy, he read the notebook Miguel had given him as if it were a map. Miguel's handwriting changed. It grew steadier, more deliberate. Sometimes Renan would discover lists inside it, things that make me brave. And each item read like a window. Blue shark, story about a friendly lion holding Renan's hand during thunder. He began to read not only as a parent, but as a student of small human economies. He practiced the rituals Beatrice had taught him until they lodged in his hands like learned songs. The exact way to tuck in a blanket when Pedrinho shivered, the way to leave the nightlight low for Miguel without waking him, the precise tone to use with João when his experiments went wrong. The boys revealed themselves in the slow things. João learned how to fold a complicated paper plane and, delighted, roped his father into competitions. Pedrinho, who had once hidden under chairs, now asked for extra chapters of the dinosaur book. Miguel, the one who kept lists, taught his father to keep small inventories of feelings. He would slip a hastily scrawled note under Renan's pillow that said things like, "Today I felt brave." Gabriel, who checked doors twice and loved routines, began leaving a tiny stack of socks at the foot of Renan's bed, as if he feared his father would forget something trivial and thus forget someone important. Beatrice called when she could. Her messages were brief: updates on medicines, a joke copied from a neighbor, a sigh about how her sister's recovery was slower than hoped. She trusted him enough to report honestly. A temper flare-up with João that had worried her, a new teacher who had asked for a parent's help. On the rare days she visited, the boys ran to her as if to check whether the world was still in order. She accepted their hugs with an economy of gesture that spoke of someone used to giving and receiving small mercies. Renan offered money in carefully folded envelopes that she returned or tucked away. She would accept the repair of a refrigerator, the payment of a debt for her sister's medication, but not the idea that generosity could pay for her agency. He learned to listen to the boundaries she set, and in that listening he felt a new humility, gratitude that could be expressed without trying to purchase absolution. There were nights when old habits tugged. A call might come bearing urgency from an old associate. It would flare across his phone like a migraine. He would feel the old reflex, the tightening of shoulders, the inventory of responses. But slowly, almost invisibly, the reflex began to hesitate. He would glance at the boy's photos on his table, at the crooked drawing of a sun, and then put the phone away. He began to use his influence to carve out time rather than to expand it. He canceled an overnight trip at a cost to a few important plans and endured the murmur of colleagues who didn't understand why he would choose pancakes over a policy meeting. Every choice was a small renegotiation of identity, a bartered compromise that meant he was losing nothing he needed and gaining everything that mattered. He learned to wear the ridiculousness of new fatherhood with grace. Friends in suits joked about him being domesticated. He laughed along, but in private he took pride in knowing the boys' favorite ice cream flavors better than any confidential report. He practiced being silly, making up ridiculously elaborate stories about a knight who misplaced his armor in a laundry basket, and the boys loved him for it. He found that humility made him laugh in ways money never had. Time did what time does. It softened edges, revealed the texture of change. Where his life had been a series of polished transactions, small domestic rituals began to accumulate into a pattern. He would show up on the school run, then go to the office and insist on a later start. He began to host dinner at the house on Sundays, inviting the boys' teachers, neighbors, and the few colleagues who accepted his new rules. At these dinners, he would watch the boys move through the room like bright planets, introducing their father to a teacher with pride. He would listen to Beatrice in the corner, always quiet, catching a story or laughter, and then stepping back into the good work of existing. Not everything smoothed out. One evening, a rumor flared in his world that required his signature and presence to calm. He sat in his car outside the place where the decision had to be made, and felt a fight he no longer desired. He thought of Miguel's notebook, and the way the boy had penciled Papi in fat letters. He thought of Pedrinho's insistence that monsters were pretend if someone held the light. He slid his phone into the glove compartment and walked away from the meeting. There were consequences. People grumbled, alliances shifted, but he kept his ground. Choosing to be present had a weight, and the world adjusted around that weight as it had to. The boys learned the contours of forgiveness. When he failed them, a missed play because of a last-minute obligation, they hurt, and then, with the soft resilience of children, moved on when he came back. He found that the work of parenting was mostly about small recoveries, repeated with honesty. He apologized not with grand gestures, but with small corrective acts. A ticket to the next performance, a hand-drawn picture on the table the morning after a missed recital, a sequence of texts explaining the reason for absence and what he'd do next time. The house changed. Little things moved from being merely functional to sentimental. A chipped cereal bowl they insisted on using, the towel that had held the first cake, a dented spoon that had survived years of being used by sticky hands. He kept that towel folded in a drawer, as if storing a promise, and sometimes he would unfold it to rub at stubborn stains and remember where he had begun. There were moments when the fear of failure returned with a particular bitterness. Once, late at night, he found himself at Miguel's bedside after a nightmare. The boy clutched his hand and whispered, "Don't leave." He remembered, in the stillness of that whispered plea, the question Pedrinho had asked months before, "Are you our daddy?" and how that question had unmade and remade him all at once. He held the hand and answered differently now. "I'm here." He said it not as a plan, but as a fact. The word was simple. Its keeping would be laborious. As months passed, the household ritualized. Breakfasts became a time for small reports. Today, I built a rocket. Today, João learned a new joke. Bedtimes were a liturgy of stories, whispers, a turned-back blanket, and a promise that whatever the world outside did, within those walls, someone would meet them. He began leaving little notes in their lunchboxes or taped to the bathroom mirror. "Don't forget to brush your teeth. Love, Papi." The boys began to leave notes in return, badly spelled poems, crayon hearts cut out and folded into his suit pockets. One Saturday in late spring, when the city felt like it was yawning awake and the air had the promise of warmth, Renan set about planning a picnic by himself. He wanted to make something that was his. No Beatriz, no borrowed rituals, and he wanted it to be honest. He burned the first batch of sandwiches and laughed at himself. He made lemonade that was imperfect but refreshing enough. He spread the old towel on the lawn and looked at it, a sun-faded rectangle that had earned its color through years of being used as a small stage for joy and consolation. He placed the cake in the center. This one store-bought because his attempts at frosting had never been flattering, and lit the candles with clumsy fingers. The boys ran out in shirts that fit more snugly than last year, their faces freckled with the first signs of summer. They applauded his clumsy arrangements as if he had performed some grand magic. Miguel, who had long since outgrown the first notebook in his pocket, and now carried a newer, thicker one, drew on the lawn with a stick. When Renan asked what he was making, the boy shrugged and said, "Our family." He held up a fresh sheet, 5 figures beneath a sun. The larger one had a crooked tie, just like Renan's. This time the figures stood together without a gap. Renan felt a heat rise through him that was not embarrassment, but a fullness he could not name. He sat on the towel and let the boys climb into his lap, and they ate and laughed and argued over who had the last brigadeiro. The world kept moving beyond the hedges. Here, for a few hours, time had given them a room of its own. At dusk, as the sky went honeyed, Beatrice surprised him by appearing at the edge of the hedge. She had returned from a trip. The doctors had given her sister a steadier prognosis, though not a neat recovery. She wore practical clothes and a quiet smile. She sat on the far side of the towel and watched the scene as if she had performed the first act of a play and was now content to see how it continued. Renan wanted to do more than thank her. He wanted to show that her sacrifice had changed the domestic geography. He offered her a plate, insisting with clumsy politeness. She accepted with the dignity of someone who has earned the right to refuse gifts and the grace to accept kindnesses. "You did this," she said at one point, gesturing to the boys. Her tone was neither praise nor reproach, just a fact. "You stayed." He wanted to put words around the debt he felt, a debt that wasn't measured in currency, but in time and care that could never fully compensate. He said, "You kept them," and she shook her head. "We kept them," she said, correcting. Her insistence refused to make the story into a one-person savior tale. She had been the axis. He had become one part of the motion. Together, imperfect and human, they had shifted the balance. Beatrice's visits after that were irregular. The sister's health demanded attention, and her life had obligations of its own. But they kept a kind of correspondence, a message about a favorite food, a reminder about a forgotten dentist appointment, a recipe she had scribbled on a napkin that the boys insisted he try. When she came, the boys ran to her, and the house, now warmer for his presence, welcomed her with ease. Renan made sure not to make a show of gratitude. He learned to say thank you plainly, and sometimes he would bring her a small bag of groceries or make the tea exactly as she preferred. He learned that repayment was not always about grandeur. Often it was about continuity. By the time the next winter began to trim the edges of the year, Renan had become known, among a small circle of people, as someone whose priorities had realigned. It was not that he had abandoned all other parts of his life. Far from it. He still negotiated, he still managed, he still answered to a world that demanded his skill. But he had discovered a way to let that world operate without it chewing up what mattered most. He had become less adroit at making enemies and more practiced at keeping the small covenants of family. There were evenings when he would walk past the framed photographs down the hall, the company's gala, a city skyline at twilight, and he would stop at the drawings taped to the wall instead. A new gallery had formed, edges overlapping, colors bright where glue had held paper to plaster. Each drawing marked a day, a rainy morning, a friend over for dinner, Miguel's first dumpling attempt, Pedrinho's dinosaur with too many teeth. One picture, from a few months earlier, showed 5 stick figures with a sun drawn like a coin overhead, the larger figure's tie crooked just so. Renan kept returning to it, as if the image itself were a small liturgy that could teach him how to be steady. The biggest changes were invisible to anyone but the boys. He learned how to be patient when João burst into experiments that stained the carpet. He learned to kneel when Pedrinho needed a bandage, not because a servant would do it, but because a father should. He learned that presence had modes, some boisterous, some quiet, and that different days demanded different kinds. It was not always heroic. No flash of contrition had remade him overnight. It was long, boring, relentless work. It was showing up when the dishes needed to be done and answering a question about algebra, despite not understanding a thing about it. At one point, nearly a year after the towel picnic that had started it all, Renan found himself in his kitchen early on a Saturday, the house quiet and the winter light pale. He laid out a simple plan in his head. A picnic again, the boys in yellow shirts like last year, a cake that he would try to make without burning. It felt ceremonial, a mark of progress that could be measured in ordinary delight. He wanted it to be small but intentional. This time, his gift should be not only presence, but competence. The day arrived warm and forgiving. The boys ran out to greet him with cries of surprise, suspicious that he could muster another celebration. He set out sandwiches, lemonade, and a box of brigadeiros he had learned to buy from a bakery the boys preferred. They wore yellow shirts, though the fit was different, less childlike, more a sign of growth. They sat in a loose semicircle around him as he placed the cake on the towel. He lit candles with the nervous precision of a man who had learned the gravity of small rituals. They sang, not perfectly, but with the auditions of real voices. Miguel, who had been sketching silently at the edge, came forward with a new drawing folded in his hand. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Renan. The drawing was dense with detail. A house with 5 figures, a tree with apples, a small dog, and in the corner, a tiny figure with a line of text beneath it. "Poppy keeps promises." The handwriting was childlike but deliberate. Renan felt a pressure behind his eyes, a tide pulling him toward language less guarded. He accepted the picture as if accepting a medal, with shaking fingers and a throat that ran thick. When the singing faded, their mouths sticky with cake and hands smeared with chocolate, Beatrice stepped back at the hedge and watched. This time she stepped forward and came into the picnic with no fanfare, as if she were one of the boys' many relatives who had always been welcome. Renan rose to offer his thanks without the awkwardness of a man rediscovering how to be grateful. He said what needed to be said, simply, "Thank you for everything you did for them. For us." She smiled, that steady smile that could contain both admonition and affection. "You did it," she told him. "You kept walking." It was approval, but the tone was tempered by the realism of someone who knows health is a process, and that people sometimes relapse into old ways. Her acceptance was not a crown. It was a measure that the work had been sincere. The picnic lasted until the light thinned into an evening that smelled of distant rain and streetlights warming. They packed away the towel with a care that made it feel sacred. The boys argued about who would hold the drawing in the car. Miguel, whose notebook had grown fat with small things, declared at some point that he was proud of his father. Renan accepted the compliment like a man who had learned not to dismiss the praise of small people. He felt, in the ordinary warmth of that moment, an accumulation of tiny rights he had earned through repeated presence. That night, long after the house had settled, and the boys had been tucked in with kisses and soft songs, Renan sat in the doorway of Miguel's room and watched the steady rise and fall of his son's chest. He kept his hand on the blanket's edge, as if to ensure that the future would be held. He whispered the words he had learned not as a performance, but as a vow. "I love you." The whisper traveled across the small room and settled into the fabric of sleep. He also said a soft, private prayer of gratitude, not that everything had been restored, not that the world beyond had been altered, but that a woman named Beatrice had taught him the language of constancy, and that he had decided to speak it back. He hoped, with a fierce humility, that someday he could open a door for her that did not hinge on his indebtedness, but on mutual respect, a chance to visit when she could, help with her sister's bills, or simply to supply the comfort of steady friendship. He would try to be the kind of man whose thanks was not an attempt to repay, but a practice of honoring. In the weeks that followed, he made an additional change that surprised even him. He opened his home to neighbors and friends who might have once been kept at a distance. He invited teachers over for dinner, letting them know the state of affairs and asking for honest feedback. He began to attend school events with a regularity that made the kids' peers comment, "Your dad comes to everything," which they said with a mixture of astonishment and pride. The boys beamed through this novelty, as if the constancy of his presence had become their badge of honor. One evening, Beatrice came by and handed him a folded paper with a small note scribbled on it. Inside were practical things he already knew: a new pediatrician's number, a tip about Miguel's shoes running small, and a final line, "Keep doing what you started. Let them have you." He pinned the note to the refrigerator like a commandment in ink. Often when the world pressed hard, he read that line and felt the gravity of its simplicity. Months rolled into a year. The small rituals had hardened into a daily architecture. He learned to let go of the urge to fix everything at once, and instead practice tiny returns: breakfast, school, a quiet check-in at midday if needed, a bedtime story. He found joy in the monotony. It was a steady heat as opposed to the piercing flare of his past life. The house no longer felt like a museum of achievements, but like a place that smelled of soap and toast and crayons. On the day of the 1-year anniversary of the picnic that had unmade him, he decided to mark it quietly. He made pancakes with extra syrup and left a small note by Miguel's bed. Today we celebrate simple things. The boys, delighted by the unceremonious festivities, wore new yellow shirts, an echo rather than a repeat of the first time, but the colors were the same, bright and domestic. They went to the garden with a basket, and he spread the old towel between the hedges, now patched in places with stitches that told of years. They ate, ran, and made a new drawing on a larger sheet of paper, a family portrait that included not just the 5 figures, but scattered stars and a tree with apples. Renan sat back and watched them with the ache and the warmth of someone whose map had been rewritten. At the edge of the yard, Beatrice stood with a thermos of coffee. She had returned with steadier hands, the sister's condition improved but not gone. She had done what she needed to do. Life had reshaped itself around the choices she had made. She accepted his invitation to sit and share the moment. The boys insisted she stay for the picnic this time, serving her the highest piece of cake as if to honor the woman who had first set the circle in motion. When the sun lowered and the light went honeyed, Miguel presented a final drawing to Renan. It was a page full of color and hurried lines, houses, suns, and 5 figures under an enormous, careful sun. Beneath the figures he had written, in large, sincere letters, "My family." Renan folded the page and placed it into his pocket like a talisman. He thought of all the small transactions that had led them here: burned pancakes, missed performances, late-night apologies, a torn picnic towel, and a woman's patient instruction. He understood how much work remained, how fragile the present could be, but he also felt a quiet certitude that he had done something that mattered. That night, after the boys had been tucked in and the house had drawn its curtains tight, Renan walked to the front gate and watched the streetlights blink on across the city. The machine of his former life still hummed beyond the hedges, but it no longer devoured his days. He folded his hands and whispered into the dark a soft private thanks for the woman who had taught him how to stay. He thought of Beatrice's roughened hands, the way she had coaxed sticky fingers into washing, the way she had left him a list and a margin note that said, "Be patient with yourself." He took his phone and typed a message to her. Not a debt-laden promise, not a check, but a note of honest gratitude. "Thank you." She replied with a simple emoji and the words, "Keep them." The message was both a command and a benediction. Renan climbed the stairs to Miguel's room and sat at the foot of the bed. He watched the boys breathe, the quiet rhythm of family that had become his true occupation. He whispered each name as if invoking a blessing: Pedrinho, João, Miguel, Gabriel. He stroked the back of Miguel's hand and said, barely louder than a thought, "I love you." There was no great fanfare, no dramatic reveal, only the ordinary admission, the kind that asked for nothing and asked for everything. In the small hours when the city slept and the house kept its own steady watch, he found himself imagining a future that was no longer about reputation outside those gates, but about the footprints he would leave inside them. He dreamed not of trophies, but of scraped knees mended with kisses, of school plays witnessed, of a table always set for Sunday morning pancakes. He promised himself he would keep learning how to be present. He would keep failing, and he would keep returning. He would keep quiet acts of contrition and louder acts of celebration. When the morning came, he walked down the hall and paused before the place on the wall where Miguel's latest drawing hung. He traced the crude sun with a calloused fingertip and smiled, a small, unsteady thing. Later that day, he would take the boys out for ice cream and listen to them argue over toppings. He would go to a meeting in the afternoon and then hurry back, leaving a clear note about a delegation he had arranged. He would keep turning the pages of ordinary days into proof that change need not be spectacular to be real. There would be more tests. Life never gives a clean run. There would be nights when his feet itched to return to the life of command, and when calls would again demand his attention. But he had learned a difficult craft, to weigh invitations and to choose the kind that built home. And the house reflected that labor in small things: drawings on the wall, a towel worn thin at the edges, the smell of lemon on a counter, the careful list Beatrice had given pinned to the fridge. He slept that night with the little crayon portrait in his pocket and the soft sound of boys breathing in his ears. He had entered this year expecting solitude as his birthday companion, and instead, through a crooked towel and a woman's tenderness, he had found the most stubborn of riches: belonging. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that showing up matters. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe and be part of the quiet work of witnessing ordinary courage.